old-timers, people who were born and raised here, seeing Point Roberts through their eyes as they take a retrospective look at growing up on the land their families homesteaded. I hope you'll join us.
I like old houses best, don't you? 'Cause they never go crowded out the view. The bricks may be dingy, the clapboards askew, but the old ones look just like they grew. From sitting so many seasons through, they've learned in 100 years or two not to go clattering up the view.
The Magnussons came here about 1902. They came from Iceland. The Icelanders came over because the times were so hard in Iceland, and there was a vast immigration, and a lot of them stayed like in North Dakota. Some stayed in Winnipeg. There's still a big center there. Some went to Victoria, Vancouver, Seattle, Blaine, and they heard there was land here that you could squat on, right? And eventually they got the right to homestead it. And it wasn't just Icelanders, there were other people too, other nationalities.
The Largo family was among the original homesteaders. I spoke with Flossie Rosenkrantz, one of the Largo daughters. She still lives in Point Roberts.
There was over 40. We bought more land too when it came from the neighbors. And then later on, my dad put up a mill and they fished. He made a seine boat, and he fished out the reef. And we raised chickens and sold eggs, and it was pretty nice while we had all those animals.
I asked Carl Julius if he knew anything about the Whalen Farm in Boundary Bay.
Yeah, I know about everything at Point Roberts. I've been here since 1918, which I came from Blaine. My dad and mother came from Blaine. Of course, I had tagged along, being 6 years old at that time. And that was my first introduction to Point Roberts when I was 6 years old. We came over in a little boat called the Welcome from Blaine to Point Roberts. We had nothing, just a couple of suitcases. And my dad got the job of running Whalen's farm. We had cows and pigs and chickens, truck gardening. We sold butter, we sold milk, all summer long. It was real busy. I remember myself at 7 years old delivering bunches of carrots and heads of lettuce for nickel apiece to different people. So my dad ran that place for 2 years.
For many years, the Juliuses lived and farmed land at Tyee and APA.
My dad's house was right there where the pear tree and the apple tree, 2 apple trees and a pear tree. If you'll notice, when you go down to that corner sometime, the trees are still there, but when Trozzolini bought the property for the marina, he tore everything down, burnt the house down. So that's the house I lived in from the time I was 7 years old until I was 16, and I left home to go to high school in Bellingham. There was no high school here. Cannery building was built by Archie Millen, and that was the days of the fish traps. Fish traps were outlawed in 1934. Archie McMillan owned a fish trap, and one of the reasons I know that he owned it, because I heard one day that he caught 50,000 sockeyes when he lifted his trap in one day. And he took them into his cannery that he had built here and canned them right there. On the job, it wasn't over a quarter of a mile away that he caught these fish. That was an awful big catch. So it must have been built around 1929, 28, 29. I fished salmon myself commercially. 1937, I started fishing on reef nets. That's the old Indian style of fishing, where you stand up on a pole and watch down in the water. When a school of fish swim in your net, you pull a net up. It's called a reef net, or old Indian style. I started that in 1937. I commercial salmon fished for quite a few years. At that time, we were getting 60 cents a piece for the fish. Not $2.50 a pound like we get now. I was here in 1934. That's when Prohibition was repealed. And that's when the Iverson boys bought the old George and Barker Company store and turned it into the Breakers, which was about I'd probably say 10-stool, 3-table tavern at the time it first opened. And they continued to enlarge the Breakers for quite a few years until it became quite a huge place. It would hold over 1,000 people. In fact, our fire department, which I was the chairman of the fire department, originator of the fire department, we had a sign on the wall, capacity 999, but I know many times they had many more people than that in there. And that is the original Breakers that burnt down. The one that's there now was only built about 3-4 years ago.
Carl recalls the history of South Beach Store, which was located at the turn in South Beach Road.
Well, it was built by Steenie Thorstensen. It was built for a dwelling, and there was a store on the east side of it, very small. Sort of a grocery store, I guess what it was. Sort of like a 7-Eleven store, small place. About 40 years before the 7-Eleven started, probably. They made an apartment out of the old store and rented it out. So it made a double place out of the big, what we called the White House on South Beach. And somebody wanted to have a store down there, so this was built as a store to take the place of the old store that was in the big white building. But that had been made into an apartment. In fact, I got into the work of putting in the plumbing in the new apartments. They put one in the basement and one on the side. Actually, it was a triplex. There's 3 places there to rent out. And the little building was built for a grocery store, or a general merchandise store. And that eventually turned into the Boondocks, which was a restaurant for quite a few years, and they did good business there.
One of the things I asked Carl to talk about was the Boundary Bay border crossing, known as the Lower Crossing. It was closed around 1975. Here's what he had to say.
Actually, there was no Roosevelt Drive at that time, so you couldn't drive from the upper customs to Boundary Bay. You had to come all the way to Nielsen's Lumber, and then make a left turn and go down over the hill to Boundary Bay. So that's why they used that customs office at the lower crossing. But after it became so accessible on Roosevelt Drive, people quit going through there, so it didn't pay to keep it open. It was faster to come straight up 56 and make a left turn, and you're right there anyway, so why go through all the crooked roads over at Beach Grove?
The Tulip was the boat that connected Point Roberts to the mainland of the United States. Most of the old-timers remember taking milk and other products from their family farms to the docks to be shipped to Bellingham.
Boat came over 6 days a week, every day but Sunday, from Bellingham. Started at the Citizens Dock in Bellingham, and if somebody wanted to come to Point Roberts, they had to be there at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's when they left, and they got here at 11 o'clock in the morning. It was a 4-hour run on the Tulip. The Tulip was about a 50-foot boat, Persane boat actually, but they used it for hauling freight and mail. The original post office was in the building that turned out to be the Breakers. And postmaster was Dottie Iverson. He was an old-timer that passed away here about a year ago. And then the post office was moved over to where the Reef Tavern is now. Yeah, it was in the Reef Tavern. There was a building where the Reef Tavern is before the Reef was there. It was called the Maples, and it burned down. So it was replaced by the one that's the Reef now. And when the post office moved to where it is now, it moved from the Reef building, Reef Tavern building, to where it is now on up by Tyee Drive, by Ben's store. Speaking of Ben's store, I was the owner of Ben's store for 14 years, and I built the majority of it. When I bought Ben's store, it was 20 feet deep by 50 feet wide. It was actually just a gas station, so I built a store on it. I owned it for 14 years. Ben's store was built by the man who ran the George and Barker grocery supply store where the breakers eventually was built. And when the canneries were going out of business, they tore down the old cannery in 1929. Ben built Ben's store in 1928, and he's the man that I bought it from, was Ben Thordarson. That he got his experience with a company store, the George and Barker Cannery.
Ben Thordarson's daughter, Hilda Castellano, was at a recent reunion in Point Roberts. She spoke about her family's home and business.
Well, my house was behind Ben's store. The one I was born in, I mean raised in, but not born in. There was an older one back in the woods further that, where I was born. My brother and I and sister. My mother was sister to Logie Thorstenson and Jonas Thorstenson. She was one of the sisters. It was a lot of fun. We always found something to do, you know, like the girls that I was sitting with at the table, they were school friends, and Maxine Teller used to be, and Audrey Teller, and we were talking about when we would slide on the ice puddles back in the woods and pretend like we were at a big fancy arena. That was fun. When I went to school here, my brother and I had to milk the cows before we went to school and turn the separator and separate the milk and the cream. And then we'd sell that to the tourists, the bottle of the milk up and the cream, and we'd sell it to the people that had camps on the beaches around here. So it was mostly Canadians that, nothing like now. They were just a few scattered at Boundary Bay, and that's where I learned how to drive my father's old Chevy truck. It was a 27 Chevy. And delivering milk, I was the delivery boy. And my mother took care of cows when my father was on the fishing boat when I was tiny. And my mom had about 4 to milk every morning and night then, and chickens and pigs to take care of, and a big garden. And 3 of us kids. But then my father retired from captain on the boat, and that's when they decided to try this store, Ben's store. It was smaller when my father and mother, when they first started, it was just to be gas pumps and, they had ice cream cones, you know, the old-fashioned ice cream cones and candy bars and that, but then they kept adding on a little bit more, and they expanded till they had a few ladies' dresses and stockings, clothing, some clothing. The main thing was gasoline. I had to get out there and pump the gas pumps up by hand, you know, then till you got 10 gallons in the pump, and then you could start. And some of the cars, I had to climb up on the fenders to get up on the radiator where the gas cap was. I can remember that.
Father started with the U.S. Customs Service back in about 1930, and then we moved here from Port Angeles, where we were stationed for 2 years. We moved here in the summer of 1934, and he basically started the first custom house here. And with these photos that I have here in front, this basically it was a tent up here on the border, where near where the location is right now located. And both the Canadians and Americans had a tent there, and that was. This was stationed here during the Depression, because there was no border here, and the liquor would flow quite freely across here and hit the fishing boats down here and then go down to Bellingham and other places. So the Customs Service was in the business of stopping illegal trade of liquor. So that's why he was stationed here. And there was 2 people. My father was Rusty Martinson, or Clarence Martinson, and Paul Davis was the other customs officer, and Paul's name slipped me because all we knew him as kids is Paul and Ma Davis.
Well, my name is Linh Simon, and I was born in Point Roberts a few years ago. And the house I was born in is no longer there, but it survived for about 100 years. First it was at one time a dance hall, another time it was a net house for the fishermen, and a home for people that rented it or owned it. And Eventually, my folks bought it, including the land which was adjacent, and they farmed it for a while, and that's where I was born in 1915. And I think the earliest recorded, or perhaps not recorded, but oral history about the place, it dates back from the time of the Fraser River Gold Rush. And Point Roberts was a convenient stop on the way up from Bellingham or from points further south. They'd land on the beach there. And there used to be a little Western-style community there, I guess, something like you see in the movies in the Wild West. And this was one of the surviving buildings from that period. Anyway, it is as I said, is no longer there because it was destroyed about 3 or 4 years ago, and there's a nice new home there now, and right on the beach. And the old house, although it was still habitable, was too old to fix and bring it up to standards of the modern homes there. You were talking about the Sorstensen home on the east side of Point Roberts. That's where my mother's parents lived, and my mother was the oldest of 5 children, and there were 2 younger sisters and 2 younger brothers. The brothers were Logie and Jonas Sorstensen, and sisters were Una Sorstensen, who just passed away recently at the age of 94, I think. And the youngest sister is still living in St. Louis. Anyway, that's a house that, as I understand, was there was originally just a log cabin built there, which is sort of a one-room cabin, a make-do thing for a couple of years while the pioneers were clearing the land and settling the place. There were a group of Icelandic people that came over from Victoria, and they homesteaded that area there. And they made themselves farms there and built homes. There was no access to any lumber or hardware stores or anything like that. Supplies were either carried from Ladner or brought over from Blaine by boat. My grandfather was a fisherman, and he had a boat that was able to haul some things over from Blaine, and so some of the things for the home were brought over. The lumber for the house was almost primarily from debris from the fish traps. They used to line the point at that time, and when the fishing was over during the fall, where they would tear these things apart and salvage the piling and things like that, but a lot of the lumber, the planks and things, would just be cast out and would land on the beaches. And this stuff was salvaged by some of the people that lived here on the point, and they used this for building their homes. And so that old house, which still stands there, has 2-inch planking in the walls and throughout the house, which used to be parts of the fish traps. The house was smaller when it was first constructed, and then it was a new wing was added on, and it has seen better days, I must say. It's in rather poor condition at the moment. I started school right here, not in this building. It was in the former schoolhouse, which was here, and my recollections are quite vivid of my first day of school. My parents were Icelandic of origin, and we spoke that language in our home, as well as with so many of the people in this area who were of the same nationality. Anyway, I was given a lesson by my mother, told certain key words that I had to know, so that I could communicate with the teacher. And of course, to this day, I can remember my embarrassment. I remember I'd forgotten one key word that was restroom, and I couldn't remember what that was, and I didn't last all day, and that's what that makes my first day very vivid in my memory. I never forgot that word after that. My father became a minister, and he had been doing some studying and was by correspondence school and so forth for several years at home here. And then when he was ready, he was admitted to a seminary in Seattle, where he studied and became a minister there. And he picked up his family. There were 4 of us kids then at that time. There were 2 more later after we got to Seattle, but we moved to Seattle, but we still had 1 foot in Point Roberts. I still do, as a matter of fact. But we'd come here for the summer, and I used to work for my grandparents, Logie and Jonas's parents, at their farm, where the old house is now. And so I spent many of my summers with them.
Joanne Baird described some of the jobs she had as a teenager in Point Roberts.
First, when we were young, we used to work in the old Georgia Barker cannery. During the peak season, we used to work about 14, 15 hours a day. And that was long hours. I'll never forget the first time I worked there. I could see cans all night. I couldn't sleep, and I could hear them banging on my head, like I used to. Oh, heck, I think I was 15 years old when I started working there. And a lot later, I worked at Burns's in the Bay, cooking chicken, frying chicken. That's the way to go. That's when they had a gas plate and an old pot over it, and we used to cook the chicken that way. Once in a while, I think it'd catch fire. And later on, they served ham dinners, and then later on, roast beef. And then they had a soda fountain. And many a time, we used to start working around 7 in the morning. We were lucky to get out at midnight. And in the evenings is when most of the people came in to have their sodas and ice cream sundaes and stuff like that and a visit. That's where Clark's store is located now. In fact, that was part of it, been remodeled. And then Whalen's had a store on the other side. And they had soda fountains then. And then George Waters had a big store and a dance hall. And they used to have dances twice a week on Saturday night and Wednesday night. They used to have some good orchestras too. And that was summer. A very lively place.
Behind me is the house originally owned by the Cann family. It's one of very few historical homes in Point Roberts that has been restored. It was built at the turn of the century, and in the 1970s, Robert Simpson bought it and started the restoration process. Now it's a wine store. Another historical house in Point Roberts is the Thorntonson Farmhouse. It was recently donated by the Thorntonson family to the Point Roberts Historical Society. The Historical Society is planning on restoring it to its original glory. In our research for this program, we were able to find many old photographs of the historical homes that are still standing here in Point Roberts. We'll leave you with a sample of our findings. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Point Roberts, Washington. Thank you for joining us.
From city, so many seasons through. They've learned in 100 years or two not to go cluttering up the view. I like old houses best, don't you? 'Cause they never go cluttering.